Everyone, Ollie here, and this is my review of Time Flight, the seventh and final story of the 19th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Peter Davison as the Fifth Doctor. Time Flight is the 123rd story overall, it's 4 parts long, and is written by Peter Grimwade. So, Time Flight, the plot of Time Flight is as follows. The TARDIS arrives by accident in the middle of Terminal 1 at Heathrow Airport. One of the one of the supersonic Concords has disappeared mid-air, and the Doctor, Tegan, and Nyssa soon become involved in the hunt for the missing aeroplane. But what connects its disappearance to a prehistoric Earth? And why is a mysterious sorcerer so interested in the Doctor's TARDIS? A time through fright will reveal all. So that is the plot of Time Flight. So Time Flight, in my opinion, is an awful story. A lot of Whovians dislike Time Flight, even calling this story one of the worst stories ever. But not just the Peter Davison era, and I do think that Time Flight is a contender for being one of the worst stories out there. It's just a very, very bad story. The production was alright. I can give props to the production. I did like how the story was filmed in Heathrow Terminal 1, and this story actually does remind me of the Faceless Ones in the Patrick Troughton era, but that story was actually filmed in a set mostly in Gatwick Airport. The sets were okay. I like the caves where the master of his disguise Khalid operated at, and I think the place outside the main caves or citadel or whatever it's called, it just looked very basic and just quite dull. The special effects were just not good, and it hadn't aged well at all, especially the plasmaton effects. It just looked like bubbles, it looked very cheap. The script wasn't that good. I mean, it was alright, but just a bit too lengthy in dialogue, and the direction by Ron Jones, he tried, but then he wasn't that fantastic. The plot was actually decent, was actually okay, but then there were some ideas there, but then the overall execution was just pathetic. It was just quite bad, and it was quite hard to pinpoint what the hell was actually going on in the story. But I do like the fact there are some similarities between Time Flight and the Faceless Ones, where both of them are pretty much set in the present day and involves obviously the TARDIS lands in Gatwick in the middle of the one-way in Gatwick in the Faceless Ones, and the TARDIS pretty much materializes on the one-way in this story. And obviously both plots involve planes disappearing during mid-flight, although in the Faceless Ones, the planes were actually disguised as spaceships, and the planes were pretty much being taken to the Chameleon spacecraft in space, so they can actually kidnap the passengers, and so the Chameleons can steal their identities. But in Time Flight, the Concords pretty much was sent back into time. Then obviously the work was pretty much the machinations of the Master. It was nice to see the Concords being used. I think they're not being used now. I think my mom told me what happened a few years ago. I can't remember what happened, but it's pretty obvious that the Concords in the story are just pretty much a way to get more people to watch Doctor Who, in my honest opinion. Time Flight actually does take place after the events of Earthshock, and the story begins for the Doctor, the dropping of Briggs, Berger, and Lieutenant Scott back into the 26th centuries, and of course, Adric's death is still very much on their minds, and of course, Tegan is quite upset with the Doctor and how he's moving on so quickly, and it's good that there's some continuity from Earthshock, and it does actually contribute to the Fifth Doctor's subtle character development. In addition, I think the Doctor remembers his unit credentials when the TARDIS ended up in Heathrow Terminal 1, and it was nice to hear unit being mentioned after unit being not being a major part of the show for since season 13. I don't think the story was that memorable, but there were some moments that did stand out, like Nyssa and Tegan coming across an apparition of Adric in the Citadel. Obviously, it was a projection by the Master, or Khalid in this case. And obviously Adric was trying to get Tegan and Nyssa to deter them from going further, but Nyssa had to remind Tegan that Adric died because he wasn't wearing his star badge, but here Adric was, but the apparition was wearing a star badge, so they pretty much had to go through him, and Adric was pretty much screamed. And the reason why this is important, the reason why Adric actually appeared in this part was because I think they were promoting, I think Radio Times was actually doing promotion for Time Flight once parts 3 and 4 of Earthshock were on the air, so Well, obviously, Adric's death was kept a secret, so they didn't want to like. So I don't think they wanted to spoil Adric's death happening, so to speak. And also like the ending of the story when the TARDIS actually takes off, when after the Master had been defeated, and the TARDIS takes off from Heathrow, and Tegan was been seemingly left behind, and she was quite upset that the Doctor has pretty much forgotten about her. So on to the acting of the story, which was alright, I must say, but it wasn't really enough to save the story. Peter Davison did a good job. I can tell he tried to make do with the script, which was just quite unimpressive, and I don't really remember the Doctor doing a whole lot of things in the story, but I do like the fact that Peter Davison has pretty much settled into playing the Doctor, and he has a good relationship with Nissa and Tegan, even though the chemistry isn't there just yet for Nissa, but it is. You can pretty much tell that there's some kind of reports between the Doctor, Nissa, and Tegan. And honestly, I liked how the Doctor randomly remembered his unit credentials when he was questioned by the police officers at the start of part one. I do like how the story pretty much mirrors in part one at the end when he was questioned by the security guards again. And he pretty much decided to take off in the TARDIS with Nissa on board and that Tegan was left behind. Sarah Sutton does a good job. She does get her body hijacked by the Seraphim, these telepathic alien beings, which we'll explain a bit more about later on. And I do speak to the Doctor and the others through Nissa. And actor Nissa was the first one to realise that something was amiss when the Concorde landed back in time, and obviously a perception photo was made to make the Doctor and crew believe that they were in Heathrow. But Nissa saw some decaying bodies almost immediately after disembarking from the plane, and she pretty much she let out a very loud scream when she saw the bodies, and obviously the Doctor was able to convince the others that something was not right. Janet Fielding was quite good here. This is the first proper story that I think where it actually kicks off Tegan's proper character development. She returns to Heathrow and is immediately thrown into the chaos of the Concorde disappearing. Tegan also doesn't have a whole lot to do, but I do like the part at the end towards the end, when she's told to try and settle the passengers back into the plane, and she does do some air stewardessing, which was very nice to see from Tegan. But after returning to Heathrow with the Concorde, she does have a moment to herself, thinking where it is pretty obvious that she's torn on going back to her job or staying or going or traveling or continue traveling with the Doctor. She does wander off to the main terminal building, but then, which is pretty obvious that she does want to continue traveling with the Doctor. But then, when she returns to the rooftop, the TARDIS has taken off, and Tegan is quite upset that the Doctor pretty much just forgot about her. I do believe she was meant to have fully departed in this story, but she was brought back for the following story in the Arc of Infinity. But I think that was a very good scene when Tegan realized that the Doctor had just taken off without her, and I did like the disappointment she had at the end. And so I think the side casts were okay. They were likable, but they were all very boring, and none of them actually died except for Professor Hater. So the first side character we had Captain Stapley. He was the captain of the Golf Alpha Charlie Concorde that he piloted with the Doctor, Nissa, and Tegan on board, and some of his other colleagues were there in the plane as well. He and Burton were in the Doctor's TARDIS, in the attempt to wait for the Doctor when he returned, but obviously they saw the Master, and then the Master pretty much did something to the TARDIS, which made the TARDIS dematerialize and ended up above the prehistoric Earth. But when the TARDIS had returned, he assisted the Doctor in defeating the Master. Then we also had First Officer Bilton. He was the first officer of the Concorde, and he also helped the Doctor defeat the Master. Then we had Scobie, the flight engineer of the Golf Alpha Charlie Concorde, and we have Angela Clifford. She was the air stewardess on the Golf Victor Foxtrot Concorde that was going to New York, but ended up in the past, and she was hypnotized by the Master to do his dirty work. She was freed by the Doctor, and she does end up helping the others in defeating the Master. Then we also had Professor Hater, one of the more key characters in the story. He was a passenger on the Golf Victor Foxtrot Concorde that disappeared. He was fortunately able to resist the Master's hypnotism because his field of work involved hypnosis. He was quite skeptical of things at first, but then he later decided to sacrifice himself so the Doctor can actually communicate with the Seraphim. And finally, we have the Seraphim. These were like telepathic aliens the Master initially destroyed with his TCE. Knew when the Master needed their power, and because of this, I think they had like I think two of them split. I think one had a good half, and one had the evil hand. Had an evil half. The good half pretty much aided Nissa and Tegan into the city or whatever the main place was, and the evil half helped the Master. I think their concept was just very confusing, to be honest. And of course, the enemy of the story is the Master. He was able to escape from Castrovalva, but he ended up getting stuck in prehistoric Earth. He disguised himself as this wizard named Khalid, and he was chanting some stuff into like some sort of crystal ball. It didn't make the place go haywire or just random shit like that. And I think that he was the most just defeated him by sending him off somewhere. At that point I didn't really care more. I didn't my care for the story pretty much just went after the monster was defeated. And I think the monster was just written terribly in the story. His motives was unclear, even though he wanted to use the Seraphim to like gain some power or something. It was just very unclear. It was just very confusing. And as I said before, how the master was defeated was just pathetic. Anthony Ainley was alright, but this is definitely one of the weaker master stories I've seen so far. Ainley also did play Khalid, but he was credited under another pseudonym called Leonite or Nite. Well, I don't know how the hell one wants us to pronounce it, which is another anagram of Anthony Ainley's name. How original. And the faults, other than the lousy writing and the special effects, there were a lot more. I think my main fault with Time Flight it was just a very boring story overall. The first part was alright, but then it did drag, but then afterwards it just fell apart after part one. I remember watching part two, it was going so slowly, and then I wanted to check like my DVD, like the time, how much I've seen of the story, and I was shocked to see that I actually watched 10 minutes of it. Those 10 minutes felt like a freaking eternity, and I was like, what the fuck? And even at that point, I was literally just like, fucking hell, I can't watch the story anymore. And the story was just very disengaging, too much dialogue, plus that awful Khalid disguise was just distracting and a bit racist if you want to ask me, and the whole bit of the Zero thing was just way too confusing and very hard to follow, and obviously the sidecast was just very uninteresting, and it was just I didn't like it at all. So to conclude, Time Flight's plot was somewhat decent on paper, but it suffers from having an awful execution, lousy writing in some areas, or a lot of areas. And considering if I this story actually aired off the Earthshock, it didn't really do the story any favors at all. A poor way to close a fantastic debut season for Peter Davison, and Time Flight gets a 3.5 out of 10. So join me in my next review. My next video will be our ranking season 19 of season 19. So thanks for watching this review. Please let me know what you thought of Time Flight and this review. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Follow me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, whatever. If you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.